There we go. And welcome to those of you now joining us on YouTube. This will be posted on YouTube within about 24 hours. Realistically, I usually have it up within the next couple of hours, but if you want to watch any of this all over again. All right, we want to thank Itasca Bank for sponsoring our webinar. Sponsors like Itasca Bank help us to keep these webinars free for everybody. Contact me for more information on sponsoring. If you know of a business or you are a business that would like to sponsor our webinars, let me know. You can also help us to keep these webinars free. At the end, when you close out of the webinar screen, you should be taken to a page with a whole bunch of resources on things you might be interested in, like our native plant guide, rain barrel information, and so much more, including our virtual tip jar. If you're enjoying these webinars, I do encourage you to donate to help TCF continue to do all of the awesome stuff that we do, because we do so much more than webinars. You can also check the box to become a member, so you can enjoy our wide variety of members only stuff too. All right, so enough of housekeeping. Let's get on to the really exciting stuff. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Kyla Muhammad, who is on our Next Gen Advisory Council. So we are so lucky to have her on that advisory council, as well as talking to us tonight about one of her favorite things. Kyla, what are you excited about growing?
Everything.
Perfect answer. Perfect.
Okay, I am going to go ahead and launch into my presentation. Get that pulled up. All right. Oops, sorry. So I would like to welcome you to Perennial Foods. Less time in the field, less fuss, and more yield. So in tonight's webinar, we're going to talk about how adding edible perennial plants to your landscape and garden can not only result in a lot less work for you, but also in an abundant yield for you and your family and the broader ecosystem as well. We're also going to talk about which particular edible perennial plants grow well in Illinois. So a little bit about me. As Jamie said, I am a member of the Conservation Foundation's Next Gen Advisory Council. I'm also a citizen scientist and naturalist, and I've studied edible wild plants, lawn-free landscaping, as well as urban farming. And I'm passionate about sustainability, gardening, cooking, rebuilding ecosystems, youth and nature education, and ensuring that all people have access to natural spaces so they can foster a deeper connection with nature. Also, in the bottom right corner here, it's a little bit of a snapshot of part of my yard, which was recently certified as part of the Conservation at Home program, which the Conservation Foundation administers for DuPage, Kane, Kendall, and Will County. And that is a program that essentially acknowledges when landowners make eco-friendly choices in their yards. So first, we're going to get into edible landscapes. And the very first question we need to answer is, why have an edible landscape in the first place? So I think there's many reasons. So the first one is food sovereignty and security. You have less reliance on the traditional food supply, and therefore you're less impacted by food supply breakdowns and fluctuations. And we've seen a ton of that over the last couple of years with COVID, in terms of you go in the grocery store and you can't find certain fruits or vegetables, or if you do find them, they cost twice as much as what they might normally cost. So growing your own food can be a hedge against some of that. You can also grow foods that aren't readily found in local grocery stores. So if you really like to try different varieties of things, then you can grow them and have access to them, whereas you might not be able to find those in your local marketplace. And you also have the ability to preserve the abundance of food that you grow for year-round enjoyment. So you can can it, freeze it, dehydrate it, and anything that you grow, that excess, you can use one of those preservation methods so that you're able to enjoy it through the winter as well. It can also improve your health because you have better control over the growing conditions of your food, So you can really optimize the nutrition of the fruits and vegetables that you're growing by really making sure that you're developing rich soil and not using chemicals and things like that. And also, another aspect is that there is optimal freshness when in nutrition when you eat from garden to table. And so what that is essentially when you can reduce the amount of transit time and storage time between harvest and when you eat the food, you're really able to maximize the availability of the vitamins and minerals that are available in that vegetable or that fruit. And if you want to learn a little bit more on that particular topic, there's a really good book about it. It's called Eating on the Wild Side by Joe Robinson. Another benefit is that you support more wildlife. Many flowering edible plants help to support pollinators and wildlife through providing food, habitat, and cover. And some of those plants can also serve as a host location for caterpillars and other beneficial insects. And caterpillars are a main food source for birds. So if you're supporting the caterpillars, you're supporting the birds. And then lastly, having your own edible landscape is rewarding and fulfilling. Part of that is seeing the development of your garden and noticing the evolution from year to year. And then you can also take up perhaps new habits like bird watching, because you're growing these additional shrubs or trees that can attract perhaps new birds to your yard. And so that could be another fun thing to track as well. And then it's also an opportunity to expose family to new tastes, as well as for them to learn more about how food grows. And this is something that is kind of missing for a lot of young kids today, as they really don't understand where the food in the grocery store is coming from. So if you're growing it at home locally, then it's really a nice hands-on way for them to get involved and to really take a deeper look at where that food is coming from. And then also too, getting your hands in the soil, breathing in that, getting that fresh air every day. These are just some of the things that help you foster a deeper connection with nature and the broader ecosystem. So next we're going to look at edible crops, annuals versus perennials. And my question is, in a head-to-head matchup, which one would win? But before we even get to that, we first just need to briefly define annuals and perennials. So annuals complete their growth cycle in one growing season, usually spring to fall. They emerge, flower, fruit, seed, and die back, all within that one growing season. And they have to be replanted every year. In some cases, that's because our harsher, cold winters will kill them off. So they might be perennials in southern climates, but not here. In terms of perennials, they have an annual repeated growth cycle over the course of typically several years, and they may take more than one growing season to complete their growth cycle. And although trees and shrubs are classified a little bit differently and go dormant in the winter, for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to treat them as perennials based off their fruiting cycles. There's also one other type of plant that I wanted to give a definition for, and those are native plants. Native plants are essentially plants that existed here locally prior to before the European settlers arrived here. So they're plants that are super resilient and they're super adaptable to the different soils and growing conditions and climate fluctuations and things like that in our area. So if we look at this little comparison chart I made for annuals versus perennials, and then even more so native perennials, we can really start to distinguish and see the differences. So starting with frequency of planting, as the name implies, annuals have to be planted annually. So that is going to be a lot more work every season for you to put those in. Whereas perennials, as well as native perennials, it's one and done. In terms of soil disturbance with the annuals, because you're planting them each and every year, there's constant soil disruption that's happening. And the reason why that is an important thing to think about is that you really want to build rich soils. And in order to do that, allowing the microorganisms that exist within that soil to really kind of build out and decompose things and build up that organic matter is important. So in the case of both perennials and native perennials, you only have that initial soil disturbance unless you're harvesting like a root vegetable or something like that. And by only disrupting the soil once, you're really allowing that soil to be left alone and develop. In terms of water requirements, annuals, it's typically high because you're trying to really encourage and stimulate that growth so you can get to harvest by the end of the season. Whereas with both perennials as well as native perennials, they do both require a fair amount of watering in order to get established. But in the case of perennials, which typically have more robust roots, once it gets established, it has more of a low to moderate watering needs depending on the plant. And then the native perennials, once they're established, typically the watering requirements are pretty minimal. And the reason for that is that native perennials have the edge because they typically have very deep root systems, and those deep roots can penetrate to deeper stores of water within the soil. So they're not as susceptible to water evaporation and things like that. In terms of fertilizers and amendments that are needed, with the annuals, you've got the one growth season. So you're doing a lot of fertilizing and amending. So that's a moderate to high need. Whereas with perennials, you might need to do that a little bit in the beginning, but depending on the plant, it's usually a low to moderate need for that. And this is really where native perennials have the edge because they were growing just fine, without us doing anything to them. So there's really minimal needs for any having to add anything else, and they should still typically thrive. In terms of the timeline to harvest, this is where annuals definitely have the edge. The harvest time is quick within the one season. Depending on the crop, you might be able to get multiple harvests in a growing season. Whereas both the perennials and the native perennials, it's a patience game. They're both kind of slow to establish typically, but once they've established well after those first few seasons, then it really picks up and they can start giving you some abundant food crops. In terms of wildlife support, annuals can provide moderate support during the growing season, but it really is non-existent over winter because the plants fully die back. Whereas with perennials, they can provide high to moderate support during the growing season and some critical support in the winter time. And that's because, if you're particularly looking at shrubs or trees and ones that produce berries, though the animals and the birds and things like that can really rely on that in the wintertime for survival. And the native perennials also have a further edge because the local wildlife has co-evolved with those particular plants. And a lot of different wildlife species have a preference for using those native perennial plants. In terms of the varieties available, there's tons of different varieties available for annuals, so they have the edge there. If you name it, you could probably find it. Whereas with perennials, your varieties and selections will be a little bit more limited. That's because, anything that's going to be perennial here does have to survive our harsher winters. And the native perennials are going to be even more limited in terms of your selection, just because you're talking about a very specific group of plants that have a long history in this area. So it's not counting, the cultivars, which are similar, but they have been bred for certain desirable attributes. And then you have drought and flood tolerance. So the annuals here are typically less resilient. Part of that, again, has to do with the root system, and it's just not as well developed as what you're going to find in perennials. Just your regular perennial is going to be more resilient there. That year after year, the roots getting more established and going wider and deeper does give it additional protection against both droughts and floods. But the native perennials have maximum resilience here, again, because they're typically can go and establish really deep or really broad roots. And so they're not as susceptible to what's happening on the surface of the soil, whether it's overly dry or overly wet. So our winner is the perennials. And that's because edible perennial plants are the more sustainable choice, and they require both less work and they support than annuals. And even better than just perennials are native edible perennials. And that's for all the reasons I just listed on the prior slide. Native edible perennials are super resilient. And even though perennials went out and they should play an important role in an edible landscape, having some annual edible crops is important to round out the diversity and nutrition that you have available in terms of your food crops. So next, I just wanted to go over a few planting considerations when you're looking at what to plant in your garden. The first thing I'm really going to strongly encourage is to observe and research to determine the best locations for your plants. You might have a particular location in mind that you're thinking would be a great spot for an edible garden, but upon doing some observation of these different variables we're going to be talking about here, you might realize that maybe that's not the best location, or maybe the location could work, but you might need to slightly change which plants you were thinking of putting there. So the first thing to look at is soil type. And the primary ones you're going to be looking at are clay, loam, sand, or a mixed media or a garden mix if you plan on amending the soil in some type of way or supplementing what's already there, or growing in a raised bed or something like that. And you also want to look at soil moisture in terms of, is it dry in that particular area? Is it mesic, which is essentially average moisture, or is it moist? And another particular thing you want to look at is the area well drained? There are a number of plants that need well-drained soil to thrive. And a lot of the different areas in Illinois, you have clay is your soil base, and clay is very slow to absorb the water in, so it will stand there for a while, but it will hold on to the water longer than some of the other soil types. So if you're going to do direct in-ground planting into clay, or that's what the sub base is, you want to make sure that the plant roots can handle that. Next is sun exposure. Full sun is typically 6 to 8 hours. Partial sun is 4 to 6 hours, and shaded is typically under 4 hours. And you want to pay attention to the sun pattern throughout both the day as well as the season, because you can notice over time that the sun patterns will change. Next is the size, and this is something that's particularly important when you go to plant. You want to pay attention to the mature size, which is the size that the plant's going to reach at full maturity. But you also want to look at the maximum size, which is like the upper limit for the size that the plant can reach. And you want to make sure that you allow enough space in between the plants to accommodate either the mature or the maximum size. And if you really want to fill in those gaps or spaces, you can do that if you like with annuals while you're waiting patiently for those perennial plants to fill in. Other things you want to be mindful of are any chemical exposures. If you're going to be planting in a particular location and you're using pesticides or herbicides, or maybe a neighbor is, you definitely don't want to have any edible perennials where those chemicals could be coming in direct contact with the things you're going to be eating. Same thing goes for roof runoff. If, depending on the age of the roof and the type of the roof, you want to be mindful if the location you're looking at might get exposed to any of that. Lead is another thing as well. If you have concerns about that, or you potentially kind of know in your surrounding area that there might be elevated lead levels, then you might want to go ahead and get a soil test done so you can see exactly what the situation is, or try to get that remediated. And then there's also juglone. So juglone is a chemical that exists in different plants, but primarily the one in our area that it's concentrated in is the black walnut tree. And the reason you want to be mindful of this, particularly if you're going to plant black walnut, is that juglone, it releases out into the soil and it can suppress the growth of other nearby plants. Not all plants are susceptible, but there are certain ones that are. In terms of wind exposure, you want to ask yourself, are there any windbreaks nearby? Which way does the wind typically blow, and what's the likelihood of wind damage? That's particularly something you want to think about when you're planting taller perennials or shrubs or trees. You just want to be mindful that you're not going to set them up in an area where they're going to have harsh wind exposure. Another consideration is mulching. Shrubs and trees really like mulch. It helps keep the soil warm, and it helps keep the soil moist. One thing to consider though, when mulching around shrubs and trees, is you want to make sure that the mulch is not bunched up right at the base of the trunk, because that can impact the health of the tree or the shrub. So if you're not 100% sure on the best way to put that down, that is something also to go ahead and research a little bit to make sure that you're mulching properly. And then the other thing too to look at are particular special requirements of the plants. Two of the big ones are really cross-pollination and if the plants are dioecious. So with cross-pollination, that's where you have two different varieties of the plant, and you need to plant those two different varieties somewhat near each other so that the pollinators can cross-pollinate between the two varieties in order to get them to bear fruit. In terms of the dioecious plants, that's where the male flowers are found all on one plant and the female flowers are going to be found all on another plant. So again, if you want to be able to get the female plant to set fruit, you need to have a male plant nearby. So the next thing we're going to look at are some of the particular edible perennial plants that grow well in Illinois in growing zones 5 and 6. So we're going to start with trees, and we're going to look at fruit trees. So the first one up is persimmon. The wild persimmon is native to our area. A lot of people feel like persimmons kind of have a honey-like taste, and persimmons can grow throughout the state, but they do like it a little bit warmer. So there's better success in the southern half of Illinois. And that's kind of similar to the next one up, which is peaches. So there are more cold, hardy tolerant varieties of peaches. So if you are going to grow it in the northern part of the state, you definitely want to make sure to get one of those. But peaches do like it a little bit warmer. So they have really good success in the southern part of the state as well. In terms of cherries, wild black cherry is native. And in the northern part of the state, primarily the sour cherries thrive really well here, although there are a couple varieties of sweet cherries that can grow here. Stella is one of the main ones. But if you're in the southern part of the state, you have the great option of choosing between sour or sweet cherries, and either one should be able to grow pretty well for you. And then there's also plums. And the wild plum is the native one to our area. The next tree is the pawpaw tree, and pawpaws are a pretty cool tree. So first of all, they're native, and it's a tropical looking tree, which is kind of unusual for our area. And it produces this fruit that's in the custard apple family, and it has this custard-like texture, but sort of this tropical flavor. So if you're looking at maybe putting something a little more unusual or exotic looking in your landscape, then pawpaw could be a good thing to consider. Apple trees are a little bit controversial amongst gardeners. And part of that is because apple trees, a lot of the varieties are prone to diseases and pests. So apples can require additional maintenance and care in order to thrive. But if you're super excited about eating apples and growing apples, I think you should still give it a try. But just know you've been forewarned that it can require a little bit more care than some other types of fruit trees. Then you have pear and Asian pear. So pears are just essentially like the pears you see in the grocery store, but the Asian pears have more of a rounded fruit, and those trees originally come from Asia. And Asian pears have been increasing in popularity and growing them in our area for a couple reasons. One, because the Asian pears themselves will store for a long time once you harvest them. And the Asian pears are also a bit more resistant to pests and diseases than the other typical pears that you might see. Next, you've got mulberry. So I wouldn't really recommend that you plant mulberry, but what I'd say is if you have access to a mulberry, then by all means, like harvest off of it and take advantage of it. The red mulberry is native. There's another one that's the black mulberry that's not native, and mulberries can be very aggressive, and part of that is because the mulberries both grow really fast, and so it can be kind of hard if you miss the seedling in the early days to get all the roots out, and it'll continue to grow. And it's also because it aggressively seeds, and then those little new seedlings pop up and like pretty much everywhere. So if you have access to a mulberry, they have bountiful, delicious fruit. And I'd say take advantage of that, but maybe not plant one. Then there's Chicago hardy fig. So the Chicago hardy fig is one of the most cold tolerant figs that you can grow, and it can survive in even northern Illinois. One thing of note, though, is you might, depending on the location that you place it, it might need a little bit of winter protection, whether that's a little bit of a windbreak to protect it against harsh winter winds, or you might need to put additional mulching on to help keep it nice and warm. But it can do well in our area. So then, going back to both the persimmon as well as the mulberry, one thing to note for both of those is that they require both a male and a female tree in order for the female tree to set fruit. And for your stone fruit, your pawpaws, your apple, your pear, and Asian pear, you definitely want to check the cross-pollination requirements on those, because in some cases you'll have self-pollinating varieties where you'll only need the one tree, but in many cases they do require another variety to cross-pollinate with, so you need two trees of different varieties. So looking at our nut trees, the first one up is hickory. Illinois is home to 10 different native species of hickory. The shagbark hickory is native and one of the most common ones that you'll probably see out and about. I've got it pictured here where you can see its nice shaggy bark. The pecan, the one in our area that grows probably the best, is the hardy pecan, and that one is native, and like the name implies, it's one of the pecan varieties that is more used to the colder climates of Illinois, so it can do well here. Black walnut, as I mentioned before, is native, but it has high amounts of that juglone that I had mentioned, which can impact the growth of certain plants. So if you already have black walnut or you're thinking of planting black walnut, you just want to make sure that in that surrounding area, you're planting juglone tolerant plants, so you won't have any issues with those. There's also English walnut, which is like the walnut that you see in the grocery store. Those can grow fine in our area, certain varieties. And then you have chestnut. So the American chestnut is native, but it's also really highly prone to disease. So if you're trying to grow mature, successful chestnut trees, you're probably going to need to get a hybrid tree, which is a mix between the American chestnut and the Chinese chestnut, in order for it to survive and thrive enough to produce nuts for you. So one thing to kind of just, bring up for both the fruit trees and the nut trees is you're going to have to be patient in both these categories. It can take, a few years before it gives you any kind of stuff to harvest. But after it gets going, then what they yield can be really abundant. So you are going to have to be patient in the early years. And another tree I included in here is the Eastern redbud, which is also native. And it shoots out these beautiful kind of pink magenta flowers in the early spring. And a lot of people don't know that both the flowers are edible, as well as the young green pods that you'll see later on in the summer. So I wanted to include that one too, because you don't normally think about harvesting a potential vegetable from a tree, but you could do that with the Eastern redbud. So next we've got shrubs. So the first one up is serviceberry, and both the Juneberry and the Allegheny serviceberry are native, and they have a similar taste and appearance to blueberry. And they're also a really attractive landscaping shrub. A lot of people grow serviceberries and don't even know that the berries are edible, but they just like them because they look nice. And if you're thinking of growing blueberry, I would strongly encourage you to look into maybe serviceberry instead, just because serviceberry is way less fussy in Illinois than trying to grow a lot of the different varieties of blueberry. So, this is all about less work and more abundant yields. And so if you kind of want something similar to a blueberry taste, then serviceberry can do that with a lot less work. Another good option or alternative for the blueberry is the next one here, which is honeyberry, which also has a similar taste, but the fruits are oblong, but they also have that deep blue color as well. Usually with honeyberry, you do need cross-pollination of different varieties to set more fruit. There's also black elderberry, which is native, and you only want to eat the ripe, fully cooked berries and the flowers from that, because the rest of the plant's poisonous, as well as eating the underripe berries can be harmful. And black elderberry is really well known for its immune boosting capabilities. If you're already buying elderberry syrup in the store, then it probably wouldn't hurt to grow your own elderberry and make your own elderberry syrup and save yourself some cash. Next up are currants. Currants are a nice one because if you don't have a ton of room, they typically only grow about 3 to 4 feet tall, as well as 3 to 4 feet wide. And so, they're good for more compact areas. The wild black currant is native, and the currant berries themselves are very abundant, and you can use them in both sweet and savory applications. So they're quite versatile. And then you also have a close relative of currants, which is gooseberry. Wild gooseberry is native, and but unlike the currants, the gooseberries, the stems do have little prickles on them. So you want to be careful when you're going to harvest anything off the gooseberry plant. But just like the currants, the gooseberries, they're very abundant. You can use them in both sweet and savory applications as well. You've got also black aronia berry and chokeberry, which is native to our area. And it's an attractive and very popular landscaping shrub all over Illinois. And part of the reason for that is because it's very low maintenance, and it's a beautiful shrub. So the reason it's called chokeberry, though, is that it has these almost black colored berries that it produces that are a little bit astringent in taste. So, but they are packed full of antioxidants. So I do think it's worth growing it, but you are going to want to typically pair it with some other sweeter fruit or some sweetener or something like that to make it a little bit more pleasant for some. Next up is one of my favorites. It's a nut shrub, the American hazelnut. And American hazelnut has a lot going for it. First of all, it's the fact that it's a shrub. As you noticed, all those other nut ones that we described are trees, and you need a lot more space in order to accommodate a tree than this shrub. So if you don't have quite as much space, but you want to grow nuts, American hazelnut can accommodate that. Also, too, it has this beautiful fall color where it's just all these different shades, and so it's very attractive as well. And then lastly, it produces hazelnuts. If like, a lot of people, you're addicted to chocolate hazelnut spread, you can now produce your own hazelnuts at home and make your own homemade spread. Other shrubs to look at are sumac. So you have smooth sumac and staghorn sumac, which are both native. You can use the dried fruit, can be ground into a spice, and which is really popular in both Mediterranean and Middle Eastern cuisines. It has this nice lemony type flavor. And sumac is another one that the leaves out almost look kind of tropical looking. And in the fall time, they turn this beautiful bright red color. So it's a very striking shrub in the landscape. You've also got spicebush, which is native. The leaves, the dried berries, the flower buds, the twigs, they can be all used to infuse this amazing fall spice flavor into things. But you are going to need both a male and female bush in order for it to bear fruit. When we look at perennial plants, first we've got our fruit plants. So there's strawberry to start us off with, and the wild strawberry is native to our area, and it produces strawberries just like what you see in the store, but they're like a fraction of the size. However, they're usually packed with strawberry flavor. Strawberries are also great as a ground cover. So if you're looking for a ground cover in your edible garden, strawberries make a great choice because they kind of shoot out these runners and start to sort of spread over time. And if you are interested in getting strawberries, one thing to be mindful of is which type of variety you're getting. So they're usually fall into two groups. There's everbearing and then there's June-bearing varieties. The everbearing varieties will produce smaller yields throughout the summer season, whereas the June-bearing varieties are going to kind of give you one really big crop for the most part at one time, and then that's going to be it. Next, we've got blackberry. The common blackberry is native. Blackberries do typically have thorns. However, there are thornless varieties available if that is a sticking point for you. Also too, you have raspberry. So the wild red raspberry and wild black raspberry are native. And for the raspberry, the young leaves also are great to use for making tea. And just like with blackberry, raspberries typically do come with thorns, but if that's an issue for the raspberries as well, they do have thornless varieties available. One thing to note for both the blackberries and raspberries are that the flowers and the fruit set on the second year cane. So in year one, the cane will grow, and it's just going to set out the leaves. And then in year two, that's when it's going to set out the flowers and the fruit as well. But then that's it for that particular cane, but come the end of the season. So you're going to want to cut that back. If we look at veggie plants, one of my favorites are walking onions, and I have those pictured in the lower corner here. I love walking onions for a lot of reasons. The first of which is that all parts of it are edible, from the bulblets that form at the top to the stem to the bulbs. They all have some nice onion flavor to them. They are a super low maintenance, easy to take care of plant. So they're not fussy. And then also as well, they grow throughout the year for the most part, unless like there's literally snow on top of them or a super hard freeze. Next, you've got sunchokes or Jerusalem artichokes, which are also native. And the part that you eat from that is they produce these edible starchy tubers. So it's a really good root vegetable to incorporate. But you do want to be careful with doing direct plantings in the ground, simply because they can spread very easily, and they're also hard to move. And that's because the tubers get pretty deep in the ground. And if you leave even a piece of tuber in the ground, it can shoot up a new plant from that. So you want to come up with a good long-term location for them. You've also got rhubarb, which you don't want to harvest during the first season. You want to give it more time to really establish so it can really produce for you in the subsequent years. And you're only going to eat the stem or stalk of the plant, raw or cooked, but you don't want to eat any other part of the plant. The rest of it is poisonous to consume. Asparagus, this is another one you're going to need to be patient with. You're going to have to wait anywhere from 1 to 3 years after you plant the crowns for your first harvest of asparagus. And that's because with asparagus, it really needs to establish a nice, robust root system before it's going to really get going on shooting up plentiful stalks. And how long you have to wait really depends on the age of the crowns that you plant in the ground. Next is ostrich fern, which is also native. A lot of people don't realize that this is one that you can actually eat. And you eat it at the stage when it first emerges in the early springtime. before the leaves begin to unfurl, and we call that the fiddlehead stage. So you want to eat it in that fiddlehead stage, and you can just chop that off and, you know, saute it or cook it up like any other vegetable, and it's delicious. Next, we've got nettles. These are typically known as stinging nettles. This is another one that's not everyone's cup of tea, but I'm going to make a case for it. So nettles have these stinging hairs called trichomes, and if you brush up against one of them, it will produce this zing of a sting. Slender nettle and wood nettle are both native to our area. And because of those stinging trichomes, you do need to be gloved when you harvest it, and you need to blanch or cook the plant to remove that sting off before you handle it any further or before you eat it. But one of the reasons why I love nettles, besides the fact that they're actually really delicious, is that they are one of the most vitamin-packed vegetables that you can eat. So they're super nutritious, and like I said, they taste good. So I think that it's worth the extra hassle in having to be gloved and harvesting them. Next is horseradish. The fresh peeled root is edible and very potent, so a little bit goes a long way. You also want to be careful with direct plantings of horseradish as well, because it does tend to spread quite a bit from the original area that you plant it in, and it does have deep roots. So if, again, you try to move it somewhere, but you didn't get all the root out, it can reestablish off of that. The next group are some of my favorites, which are perennial herbs. I am an herb fanatic. I love herbs because really they impart so much flavor into when you're cooking a dish. And what I want you to see here is that there are actually a lot of different perennial herbs that you can plant one time and they will yield for you every year with all sorts of different flavors. So I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but I'm going to point out a couple things. If you're looking at growing mint or lemon balm, I strongly encourage you to grow those in pots because they do tend to spread pretty aggressively if you plant them directly in the ground, whereas you can kind of keep them a lot more contained by having them in a container. And then also I wanted to call out a couple of the perennial native herbs that you can use. The first one is wild bergamot, which is native, and you get both the leaves and the flowers are edible. So you can use the leaves as an herb. And then also wild onion, also known as wild garlic, and nodding onion are also native as well. And those impart kind of a taste similar to chive, a nice subtle onion flavor in your dishes. The other thing I wanted to point out, which you see here in both my picture of the culinary sage as well as the wild bergamot, is that many of these different perennial herbs, if you let them go to flower, are absolute pollinator magnets. So if you want to do the pollinators a solid and help them out, go ahead and let your perennial herbs flower, and then, you know, let them go crazy, and then you can go ahead and cut them back at that point. Next up are perennial vines. So we've got, first up are grapes. Wild grape is native. The fruit, the young leaves and tendrils are all edible. You are going to need both a male and a female vine in order for it to set grapes. You've also next got hardy kiwi. It has a similar taste to the commercial kiwi that you get in the store, but they're much smaller. They're like grape sized, but you don't need to peel them like you would a normal kiwi. They have nice, thin, smooth skin versus kind of that furry skin. But it can take 1 to 3 years for them to set fruit. So you do need to be aware that you need to be patient with this one as well. And you're going to need a male and a female vine to produce kiwis. The next one is groundnut, and groundnut is also native. And this one's interesting because it actually has a really long history of use here in America as a staple food crop. And the parts that you can eat are the cooked tubers as well as the seeds. But I'm going to warn you a little bit that if you want to plant that and eat it, and you're not already super used to it, you want to probably ease into consumption, just because it can cause a little bit of digestive upset if you're not used to already eating it. And actually the same thing goes for sunchokes or Jerusalem artichokes as well. You probably want to ease into consumption with those a bit too, because they initially, if you eat too much of it, it can cause a little bit of digestive upset. And the last one for the vines is hop. So American hop is native, and the cones, also known as hops, are produced by female flowers, and they're used to flavor different things like beers and teas. So if you're a aspiring home brewer and you haven't already looked into maybe trying to grow some hops in your yard, then this might be a good choice for you too. One thing to keep in mind though with any of these perennial vines is they need a lot of climbing space. So you want to make sure that you're able to accommodate for that. The next grouping is also a little bit controversial. Wild perennials. A lot of people would consider these plants that I've selected as weeds, but weeds is really a subjective term. I mean, really what weeds means is any plant that grows somewhere that you don't want it to grow. And particularly, you know, if you are going to be getting rid of any of these plants from your landscape for whatever reason, and you're not going to, you know, be doing that through a chemical means, then might as well put them to good use and eat them. That's kind of my opinion, versus just tossing them out. So the first couple we have here are dandelion and chicory. They both are similar and related to each other, and they have the same edible parts, which are flowers, leaves, as well as the roasted root. And I actually have a very delicious dandelion chai tea that I make. And pretty much anytime I'm pulling dandelions out the garden and doing some weeding, they typically end up in that dandelion chai tea. The next one are violets, and particularly the common blue violet, which is native. It really kind of doesn't belong in this category, in my opinion. It's literally the Illinois state flower. So at some point, the state, you know, knew the value of the violet. But both the flowers as well as the young leaves are edible. And then the last one, which is public enemy number one with a lot of folks, is Creeping Charlie. So with Creeping Charlie, both the young leaves are edible raw or cooked, but really I can't say that, you know, if you're just going to throw it in a dish that Creeping Charlie is going to be delicious. The best use for it is either the fresh or dried leaves and using that as a tea, or mixing that with other herbs in a tea, and it does impart a nice mild mint flavor. So, as Walt Disney once said, the way to get started is to quit talking and begin doing. So I'm going to encourage you to take some action through the following action steps. First, commit to adding at least 6 perennials to your garden or yard for 2022. And herb gardens totally count. So if you don't have a lot of space, or you're feeling kind of nervous about jumping in too soon, you can totally do them all with herbs. That is fine and perfect. Select things that you're excited to eat and that fit the growing conditions of your available space. You want to be excited out the gate for this. And then as an extra little bonus challenge, try and make at least 3 of them native plants, not cultivars, but just the straight native plants. In the spring, go ahead and plant your perennials. If you're going to be, planting like transplants versus doing seeds, compost and mulch are your friends. You want to plant nice and wide versus deep. And you want to make sure to give consistent watering as needed throughout the spring and the summer of that first year in particular. And you're going to be looking for new growth as signs that the plant is establishing well. The next one is probably the most important thing, which is be patient. Do whatever you need to do while you're waiting for those fruits or nuts to be harvestable. So distract yourself with annual crops if you need to, and pay attention to that and immerse yourself in the annuals while you're waiting for the perennials to mature. And once they're ready, harvest your fair share, but make sure to leave some for the wildlife too. In doing this, obviously, we want benefit for us and our family, but we also want to benefit the broader ecosystem as well and support wildlife. So leave them a little bit to help them out too. And then, each year, keep adding a few more perennials until you've got eventually all the perennials that you'd like to go. And at that point, you're going to have a super abundant harvest of more than you'd ever know what to do with, that you can share with both your friends and your family. So I do have a few additional resources to help you get started. So I have a couple links for design ideas for planting your perennial edibles here. One is a link to the Resiliency Institute, which is out of Naperville, and they have a design for what they call a fruit tree guild. And then the other link is actually by University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and it has this PDF of a really helpful, all these different edible perennial and trees and shrubs, and they go into all sorts of details about the growing sizes and the conditions they need and things like that. The next one, if you're looking to match native plants to your space, Possibility Place, which is a native plant nursery in Illinois, has a very helpful plant finder. And if you select the edible fruits filter, along with any other conditions that you're trying to match to your space, then that can kind of help you match up different edible native plants that can work for your growing location. And then the last link, it is from University of Illinois Extension. And if you're looking specifically at trying to grow a particular herb, this link has some really good information about the specific care that's needed for the different herbs. So with that pretty much concludes what I've got. If you want to learn more about some other related topics, you could go to my newly launched website, which is eatgrowplay.com. You can also connect with me on Facebook or Instagram at eatgrowplay247. And the Conservation Foundation on their YouTube channel, they've got a couple of videos of, I did a pretty massive renovation of my yard, turning it into an edible landscape. So they have a couple of videos kind of walking you through that whole, the results of that whole process. And then if you have any questions or anything after this webinar and you wanted to follow up with me, I've got my email address down at the bottom as well.
That was fantastic, Kyla. Thank you so much for that. I tried to quickly copy the links that you had there into the chat so people can click on them. I think I missed one.
I can go back to, I can sit down that. That's probably if people want.
There we go. Yep, I missed the extension one. I knew there was one. But yeah, thanks for mentioning Possibility Place. They are great. I love that plant finder they have on their website. It's really for any of your native plant needs, just to go in there, look at their pictures. You can throw in your conditions into that plant finder and really get a nice list. And they do ship too now, which is nice. Or you can make the drive down to Monee if you're like me and fairly close to them. So so I was taking a few notes as I was going through here. There were a couple of things that I wanted to mention. Thank you for mentioning the issues with mulberries. They are absolutely delicious. I have a mulberry tree in my yard before I realized what it was and how messy, let's say, they can be. But when my son was a baby, he loved to be outside, wanted to be outside all the time. And when the mulberry tree was in fruit, that little finger was up there pointing, he wanted to eat them all the time. He could just eat them by the fistful.
My kids too.
They are that good. The white mulberries are the invasive, well, I think black is too, but white mulberries are also the invasive ones, and they really easily hybridize with the natives. So yeah, you're really lucky if you have a red one. Most of the ones around here are white, and I probably would not have let it keep growing if I had known. It's a great tree now, but it's getting really big and out of control, and I'm pulling up its babies everywhere in my yard.
Yeah, the mulberries did kind of have like a massed season this year, I think, in at least in the northern part of Illinois. And I think that's because we had that late frost
Yeah,
last year. And so a lot of them didn't produce much or if any fruit. And so it just seemed like all that stored up energy just poured out this year. And yeah, I had
for sure.
pounds upon pounds of mulberries.
Yeah, but oh man, they are so delicious though. Love them so much. I did not realize you could eat red buds. I have
Yes.
one in my yard. They're one of my favorite trees. I am going to need to look that one up now, along with the wild bergamot bee balm.
Yes.
That's another super aggressive native, or at least a couple of the varieties of it are. And so I have it all over my yard. I didn't know I could eat it though, so I'm going to have to look into that.
And that's the great thing with all these different things is once you discover that it's you can eat it, then it's like you start looking for ways to kind of incorporate it into different dishes and things and play around with them, which I think is fun too.
Oh yeah. Well, it's like I've got Eastern prickly pear in my yard too, which is also edible. And I've in all the years, I mean, I pulled a couple pads from my parents' house because we had it when I was a kid in our yard, oddly. And so I pulled a couple pads when I moved out and have been growing it ever since. And I have never attempted to eat it. I think I'm just too afraid of all those little trichomes on it.
And it takes a lot of like preparation to extract out the parts you want and get past the parts you don't want.
Yes, for sure. For sure. And then, yeah, the usual warnings on things like horseradish and lemon balm were good as well. Quick little story. When I was a kid, my dad had planted horseradish, and when it just got to be like way too big, he didn't want any more. He dug it all up, and the next year it came back.
Yep.
And so he dug it all up that year, and the next year it came back. He finally got tired of it and poured a cement foundation on top of it. It came up around the sides.
Oh my God. So there you heard from right straight from Jamie's mouth. Like if you're planting horseradish, it will be permanently in your landscape.
And I tried to do lemon balm because I thought, ooh, I love tea. I'm going to make my own, I'm going to go, full prairie woman here, like plant my own tea garden. And so knowing how aggressive it was, anything in that mint family gets super aggressive. I put it in a quarter barrel that was sitting on my patio. There was something weird with it. The tea just never quite tasted right. So I pulled it all out of there. It's now trying to take over my lawn. So it still managed to jump out of the quarter barrel and is all over my lawn now, which, smells wonderful as it's being mowed, but it is, yeah, it shows up everywhere too. So the staghorn sumac that you mentioned too, I used to work at a museum, and apparently in Native American cultures, they would use staghorn sumac to make a lemonade-like beverage.
I've actually, tried something similar to that.
Yeah. And so that was always an interesting fact because we had some growing there on the property. So it was always fun when we were doing tours with kids to talk about how you could take that little fuzzy looking berry on the staghorn sumac and make a drink out of it.
Yeah, it is. It does impart a similar kind of sour flavor as to the lemon. I mean, of course, also with lemonade, you got to add a bunch of sweetener to it to kind of get that full lemonade taste. But I'd say sumac is similar to what you'd have to do for lemons and lemonade.
Yeah. Hey, so we have a question here. Have you thought of growing false nettle? It doesn't have the spines that sting.
I have not. I'm familiar with false nettle, but I don't know that it actually kind of also like how the name is saying, like I don't know that it has necessarily has all the same like nutrition profile and everything, like if it exactly how similar it is to a true nettle. So I've not looked into that particular plant in terms of growing or eating it. And like I said, if you actually give the true nettles a try, they're really good and nourishing. when I eat something that has nettle in it, I feel like nourished afterwards. So I think it's still, I mean, yes, it's probably not necessarily a beginner plant, but if, you know, down the road, you're feeling kind of confident, you want to tackle something a little bit, you know, take on more of a challenge, then I think it's worth putting in the mix.
Nice. I also would wonder, because there's another member of that family that grows around here, wild, called clearweed, that looks very similar to stinging nettle. I actually thought it was stinging nettle for a long time before I figured it out. So I would wonder if that's A, edible, and B, if it would have the same nutritional value as the regular stinging nettle. I don't know. Something to look into.
Yes.
Audrey would like to know, are you self-educated or did you study through a program?
So I studied through a number of different programs, not like a university program. I mean, some of these different types of things too, like, you know, the edible wild plants. I did a year-long course through the Resiliency Institute on that. You know, currently even with the urban farming, that is through University of Illinois Extension. So they're formal programs, but they're not, you know, like through a, it's not like a university degreed program.
Yeah.
But then, you know, a lot of this stuff too is also, it is, you know, doing your own independent research. There's some really good books and resources and things like that for you to take a deeper dive on a lot of these topics. And that's what I've done with a lot of the wild edible plants and things like that too. In addition to the year-long class that I took, you know, one author on that is Samuel Thayer. He has a series of books that are really detailed guides with really nice pictures, because I know, particularly if you're going to ever be trying to harvest something and you're trying to ID it, particularly something that you didn't plant, you always want to be, you know, 100% positive of that identification before you try and eat it. And so his series of books are great because he takes the time to really painstakingly go through and illustrate that you have the right plant. And then he also calls out any poisonous lookalikes, and he'll go through again painstakingly and show you all the differences.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, that's what honestly makes me afraid to even try wild mushroom foraging. Like, I know for a fact that there are a lot of lookalikes that are poisonous, and like, I'm not even willing to go. I know a lot of people who do and do great and are very confident in their IDs, and good for them. But that is not something I would be brave enough to tackle.
Yeah, you want to be 100% confident on that.
Yeah. And wants to know, you said it was Samuel Thayer was the author?
Yes, I can put in the chat, I will spell his name.
Oh, perfect.
For you.
Perfect. And then while you're doing that, I wanted to mention Doreen had asked about wild plums and wanted to know some place to buy it. So thank you to those of you who chimed in on that. Yeah, Possibility Place, I'm pretty sure I have seen they had it. There is, I mentioned also in the comments, there's a newer native tree and shrub place out of Mokina called Native Roots and Canopies. And I know for a fact that they had American plums because I got one from them. So a little bit smaller, but beautiful looking trees. Got that in and planted this year, and it's doing very well. And I can't wait to see what it does. I've been kind of obsessed with the idea of getting an American plum for a number of years. So I was really glad to finally get one. But again, of course, it will probably be many years hence before I can actually get any fruit off of it.
Patience is key.
Ted wants to know about the slides for the webinar. I got to be honest, I don't know how to share files through the Zoom email, but this has been recorded and will be available on YouTube. So you are welcome to go back and watch anytime you would like. I should have it up, as I mentioned at the beginning. I should have it up within the next couple of hours, definitely by tomorrow. It'll be posted there too. So if you have any other specific questions about the presentation, about certain slides, you're welcome to email me. My email is the one that all of the emails about the Zoom presentation came from. So please feel free to share that. Oh, I may have mistyped that first link in the chat. Sorry about that. I was trying to type quickly. Kyla,
do I need to pull it back up?
If you could flip back to that first one and see, I may have typoed somewhere. My apologies. So yeah, so anyway, so this presentation will be on YouTube in a little bit. All right, let's see, any other questions? Lots of wonderful thank yous and comments on there. So with that, if there aren't any other questions that I'm seeing, we will go ahead and end it here. Want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. Hope to see you again on, I believe I said December 1st, the first Wednesday in December, where we will do our next webinar. Stay tuned to your emails and to Facebook for the title and topic. Like I said, I'm working very hard on it right now. Oh yes, Midwest Ground Covers is also very good, as well as there's a lot of places, a lot of smaller nurseries that sell their stuff. So again, if you have any further questions, please feel free, drop me an email, jvbach@theconservationfoundation.org. If I can't answer it, I've got Kyla's information too. She's got her email there as well. But thank you all for joining us today. And thank you so much, Kyla. I managed not to call you Kayla.
You made it through the whole thing.
I made it through the whole thing. So thank you so much for sharing all this great knowledge with us and all your experience from your yard. This is fantastic. I know you have inspired me to even some of the things that I have in my own yard to attempt to eat them once I figure out how to do it.
Excellent. That's what it's all about.
I planted 2 elderberries last spring. They had berries this year, and I don't know if I just ate them too early or what, but I ate one and kind of regretted it immediately. I think I needed to turn it into syrup or something. It was not good.
Wait, you cooked it first, right?
No, I just pulled it off the plant.
No!
It was the wrong thing to do. I fully admit that. It was the wrong thing to do.
We'll have to talk about proper preparation for those.
Yeah, I get that from my dad though. I can't help it, just that, oh, hey, this looks good. I really should know better. So anyway, thank you all, and we hope to see you again next month for our conservation online webinars. Thanks everybody. Take care. Good night.